Hello, my friends. This is John Edward Willie, and I'm taking a brisk walk through Kansas City, Midtown, on a Monday, a beautiful evening. And I'm doing what I do, thinking openly about philosophical questions, hoping to string together connections of ideas that I hope to elucidate a general idea. But I also hope, as always, to sort of surprise myself along the way. That is to discover what I didn't know to be the case by saying it aloud. That is, by connecting the dots aloud, which is sort of the surplus effect of an open-ended monologue with oneself. In many ways, this is a kind of musical, performative gesture. I brought that up before, but I think that on days like this, when everything is so especially beautiful, the musicality of it all really speaks. Meaning that there's something to be said for a body in motion that's thinking in a way that's almost akin to a thought that is wandering with the body, as if the sort of discovery that one makes in walking down the same paths that one walks every day, wherein one discovers every day the unexpected amidst the ordinary. So in everyday rethinking of everyday thoughts, I think we rediscover what is extraordinary about life itself. We're always assuming that we're thinking about something beyond, or that we're thinking our way to a kind of emancipatory moment, or that we're thinking as a means to solving a problem alone. Rarely do we consider the possibility that thinking itself is not circular in the reductive sense that many people's thinking is circular, but that there's an inherent circularity in thinking, which I'm suggesting mirrors the circularity of a daily walk. And so here I am, considering the nature of ethics. That is, from a philosophical point of view, I'm thinking openly about the nature of ethics, which I'm suggesting is circular insofar as it's always already a consideration of the most basic kinds of questions. And so unfortunately, what I'm doing in many of these videos isn't very sexy or alluring. In fact, it's perhaps boring or pointless to those who have no interest in doing what I'm doing. But as I've said in other videos, I'm sort of laying the groundwork for further investigations. The first videos in this series were so basic that they almost had to do with nothing at all. In fact, they were questions regarding the nature of justification for our beliefs, the nature of our knowledge, the questions as to what truth is, the questions as to how we can constitute a methodology that will allow us to arrive at some kind of truth. And then beyond those videos, I began putting the pieces together and investigating perhaps more meaningful questions, such as the question of language. I investigated the question of knowledge. And in this video, I'm looking at ethics, which is a very basic but very misunderstood kind of question. And the way that I'm going to approach this is largely by dividing it into its two camps. On the one hand, there is what is called moral relativism or ethical relativism. And on the other hand, there is a kind of ethical absolutism, or a more subtle version would be a kind of ethical realism. And so this divide between a kind of relativism and realism in ethics is in many ways the landscape within which we're always trying to think about what is the ethical and what is the political. And furthermore, I hope to perhaps say a little something about what I think in my own perhaps personal way about what the ethical might mean, as well as perhaps something about what the ethical means for Nietzsche and for others who are attempting to consider the nature of values and the ways in which our ethical positions demand more than we may be able to give. And I would hope also to sort of elucidate what this would mean as being not the end, but the beginning point of another way of thinking about the ethical. And first of all, I have to offer a kind of preface or a prelude regarding the strangeness of ethics itself, because from one point of view, it's almost antiquated to consider ethics as even being a question in any way, given that if one is attuned to the nature of our constant metaphysical claims, one is also attuned to the inherent ridiculousness of any ethical claim. That is, any statement about what is right and wrong, about what is good or bad. All of those, in spite of their continuity with our mental lives, are not only as strange as other kinds of mental claims that we make. That is, we're often making claims about beliefs in the metaphysical, which in point of fact, our experience doesn't justify. And that's why in my other video about the nature of knowledge and where knowledge comes from, which is sort of an investigation of empiricism and rationalism, I had asked the question regarding many of our propositions in language, which we continue to sustain without verification by the senses. That is, we do not, in fact, in experience, directly live with the kind of beliefs that are, in fact, contradictions within us, given that there's almost a sort of a priori or a necessity in believing in particular propositions about what constitutes the real. Even perhaps the belief in the self as a separate entity from the world around us is a kind of metaphysical claim within which we're unable to think otherwise. That is, we have to have a belief in a self, at least for working purposes, which any clear vision of reality would cancel out. And to go beyond that is what the ethical is. The ethical, in fact, is proposing something even more unreal. And when one considers the fact that there are no ethical properties in the natural world, one discovers that there is a reason why many people laugh at the possibility of an ethical question. And so there's sort of a tertiary approach that we're taking, which is that it's one thing to have empirical knowledge, to have an understanding of the world that's rooted in what the senses can understand, but it's another thing to begin believing in identities and narratives and other sort of fantasies which cannot be proven. But it's a whole other thing to practice the ethical or the political, which itself is a extraordinary proposition. It's sort of a narcissistic, self-indulgent, alien endeavor to prescribe ways of living, to prescribe, or that is to suggest a solution to the problems that people face in the name of what is right and wrong, in the name of what is good and what is bad. That in itself, from this three-leveled approach, is so removed from the actual descriptive nature of people and things as to make it laughable. And not only that, when you consider the practical reality in the actual nature of people, in their nature, it seems almost stupid to imagine that we can even consider what is good or what is bad. And one is left, in fact, in a position of power, of advocating power or taking power, if one is having any clear sense as to what it would mean to live and act in a world that wasn't propped up by ethical abstractions and propositions. And that is almost so common as to go without saying. That is, what I'm expressing is the most common kind of cynical, passive, nihilistic view that one can have. That is, it is almost passé to express reservations about moral claims. So we sort of live in an age of moral relativism. It's almost impossible to consider the alternative, that is moral realism. And so perhaps it's of more benefit to defend the possibility that there is something to be said for ethical claims than it is to accept the most common position, which is that it in itself is impossible, which, by the way, for anyone who has lived their life at all and paid attention at all, is not only ludicrous, that is ethical nihilism, or the refusal to think ethically, is not only absurd, but it's actually hurting people involved. And one can't imagine that a great deal of unnecessary harm and hurt in the world is caused by people who outright refuse the possibility of the ethical, because not that they see themselves as limited, which is a real kind of claim, but that they see it as an impossible act, given that it's impossible for anyone to make any kind of claim at all. And not only that, there's the possibility of criminal proclivities, which anyone who's thinking openly about, as I said, living in a world without ethical premises, sees as an opening, so long as they're not caught, and there's a kind of justification for this, even from a kind of Nietzschean point of view. And I think that's why we will bring up Nietzsche at a later point as being a radical kind of reconstitution regarding the nature of ethical claims in a modern age. But there's a more fundamental argument that can be made for the nature of ethical claims, which is that the a priori in the ethical dimension is in itself an expression of the transcendent. That is, one is not in insisting upon a moral claim, one isn't insisting upon the transcendental or transcendent. What one is doing is insisting upon the definitional quality of an event or a person or an act, meaning that murder is wrong not because some god has decreed that it's wrong. Murder is wrong because, by definition, murder is wrong. And so one can see, even if one doesn't agree, the beginning of a possibility of a dialectic within oneself if you don't believe in ethics, if you reject the possibility of moral claims. This, in many ways, is a kind of opening which leads to other kinds of openings regarding ethics, because it's not merely a sly, sort of smug response to the true nature of ethical relativism to say that murder is wrong because I say that it's wrong, but that it's wrong by definition is not to insist upon a universal claim, because to insist upon murder being wrong by definition is to open up the conversation regarding the definition of murder, because anyone involved in legal cases or involved in any moral complexity begins to discover that it's not necessarily the world in itself, but that there are possible different kinds of definitions about what acts are. Like drugs, for instance, what constitutes a drug has to do with the determination of these ethical laws that are taken as being true because they're true. And so this is a step into a rational consideration of ethics. And it's not that I believe in it. I don't really think it's important in many ways, what I think, so much as it is important to see that it is possible to have a dialectic, that is, to have a kind of back and forth within oneself about ethical claims. Because on a certain level, and it's not that I actually believe this, but I do think that participating in this kind of act is precisely what opens up a sense of the complexity of the ethical world. And I think that's one of the most important points in regards to the question of ethics. It's to see the overwhelming, all-engulfing density, opaqueness of our moral dilemmas that we face. And nothing is simple. Nothing is black and white. And this in itself, the paralyzing, overwhelming grandeur of political complexity, really just dwarfs the very sense of the ethical that we are longed to have. And that in itself represents another kind of possible nihilism, because one can be left completely overwhelmed and never return. But that in itself is to miss the point, which is that we are called upon, whether or not we are ethical, we are called upon. The ethical from the philosopher Emmanuel Levinas's point of view, is a kind of calling. And when considered as a possible temperamental quality or a particular ontological orientation, the ethical then places a demand upon us. That is, it is not a theoretical kind of thing, but it's something that is built into the moving motion of our actual social lives. And so wrestling with that kind of complexity from Levinas and Soren Kierkegaard's point of view means to wrestle with the human situation. And that in itself is crucial. I've said that it's important to remember that one is always wrestling with a kind of chaos and complexity that almost oversaturates our ability to even think clearly. But that this in itself is precisely the human situation is the second crucial point. And that in being human, we are wrestling with this. And to cast it aside is to cast aside being human being, whether that means taking Xanax and medications to sort of blank out or losing yourself in work. You know, there are all kinds of ways in which we are able to avoid the fact that we are living out particular lives, and in doing so we are making certain decisions, because it's not as if we are like sort of like being the kind of people that can like exit our bodies and like think outside of ourselves and sort of see outside of ourselves, but that we are put in a position where we have to see as much as we can and put together the pieces that we can, so that we can at least understand a little and therefore possibly wrestle with a little bit of what is before us. And I know I speak in these hyper abstract ways, but it's because in many ways I'm trying to speak in the most general gestures and to include as much as I can. But what I'm also wanting to stress is that there really is no resolution between moral relativism and the possibility of there being ethical claims, in that being ethical or making ethical claims is so much a part of who we are that to think that you are yourself free from it is ludicrous. It's not that you might be free from Judeo-Christian ethics, you might be free from the sort of overly rational, positivistic Western ethic, but it doesn't mean that you're free from, as I've said, the call and demands of your life, which face all of us, and yet that doesn't really mean what it might mean. And so that brings me to my own possible position, which I hope to suggest at the end of this video. Because one thing that has to be understood regarding the strangeness of ethical claims is that not only is one making an a priori kind of synthetic judgment, but it may be, in fact, when you see that ethics is not something that lives in the world so much as it lives in our subjective kind of understanding of the world, one begins to see that to say that something is right or wrong, or to say that it is good or bad, or to say that it is unethical or ethical, is really to express a kind of judgment on one's part that really can't be justified. That is, it is to express a kind of satisfaction or an approval with something. That is, to say that something is true, that to say that something is good is really just in many ways to express a kind of an opinion. And this is called emotivism. You know, emotivism means that we're expressing our emotional judgments when we are attempting to describe what we think of as being a must be, that it must be the case. That is, when we are confusing the descriptive for the prescriptive, you know, and we do this so constantly that we really forget that we're doing it. And it can be said that we really haven't caught up with what we know about the natural world, with what we know about ourselves as being bodies, and what we really know about power and the nature of power. Our ethical claims and our thoughts about ethics, especially so long as they're saturated in all the different kind of narratives that exist, largely are divorced from the fact that, in fact, there is what could be seen as a kind of nihilism facing it. And that isn't nihilism in the way that I have been speaking negatively about it, but it's a kind of nihilism that has to do with Jean-Paul Sartre's book Nausea, which is sort of a Frenchified attempt to look at phenomenology, the phenomenology of Heidegger. And the thing that Jean-Paul Sartre is doing in Nausea is attempting to contend with the fact that we live in a world which doesn't respond to us, which doesn't speak back to us. That is, we live in a world that is unconcerned. We are absolutely irrelevant. And so long as the human species goes extinct, no one will think otherwise. And that in itself isn't inherently negative or inherently positive. That in itself, for Sartre or for anyone who's thinking in this way, is a kind of starting point. And so what I mean to say is that moral relativism, or the idea that moral claims are emotional claims, isn't merely to negate the possibility of ethics, because in fact one can practice a kind of creative ethical thinking which refuses to see things other than things as they are, but it wants to work with things in a maximal creative way so as to work out the best possible consequences. The trouble with this, of course, is that in fact it's not intellectually serious, because it's not in fact wrestling with the fact that this then is not an ethical act. It has to have another kind of name, and it can be thought of as existing in other kinds of ways. But again, it's a preliminary to how it is that I think about the ethical. But in regards to the possibility of ethics as being a kind of necessary act, that the definitions of things are necessary, this itself is crucial when one is seeing that there really is no argument about the fact that for almost everyone, rape is wrong, murder is wrong. There are things that in every single culture, in a universal way, you find that people are against, that there is a kind of instinctive kind of ethical urge in all cultures. The trouble is that it doesn't really hardly ever become universal, because it really is in fact hidden and in fact often warped, entangled within various cultural norms. And yet it also doesn't really stand up to any kind of claim or verification, given that it really exists as a kind of commonsensical thing, meaning that stealing is taken to be wrong, that murder is taken to be wrong, and there are all kinds of other acts that we overly complicate and work into abstract legal language and ethical codes, but are in fact beneath everything a kind of fundamental living base that we're all operating within. This is itself sort of a really bad way, a clumsy way of articulating the possibility of there's something being something other than moral relativism. And on another level, what one is working against is the kind of moral absolutism which radiates from people who are really insistent upon the existence of God or a transcendent entity as being the only basis for ethical claims, as being the only basis for morality. And this in itself is fundamentally mistaken. One can defend the possibility of there being an a priori ethical claim, but that doesn't really have anything to do with the kind of evangelical insistence upon a belief as being the only basis for ethical belief. As an atheist at the age of 16, I remember being in many fierce arguments with religious believers, and that would always be the kind of discussion we would have, which would be, how do you know what is right and wrong, or how do you know what is ethical in a world without God? And of course I had no language and no way of really wrestling with this, but over time it became clear to me that one's belief, whether one is an atheist or a believer, has almost nothing to do with the ethical nature of the person. And that's why to this day I don't really associate a person's beliefs with who they are in almost any way, because what one is and who one is, that is the ethical nature of a person, is almost a kind of biological expression of sympathy, and the sympathetic is fundamental in human beings. And had I been able to say this at the time when I was arguing with religious believers, I would have said that it has nothing to do with belief at all, that it's obvious to us. And had I been thinking even more clearly, I would have brought up the philosopher Plato's Euthyphro. Euthyphro is a book written by Plato, and it's effectively a kind of dialogue, or it is a kind of dialogue. And the fundamental claim in Euthyphro is that the reason why things are right and wrong isn't because the gods decided that they're right and wrong. The gods decided they're right and wrong because they're right and wrong. That is, 2,500 years ago, Plato, in the Euthyphro, completely leveled the idea that we need God at all, or that we need God as the basis for our belief in right and wrong. And the way that he did this is by arguing that what is right and wrong effectively transcends the decisions of gods. Because imagine that God had decided that murder was okay, and that rape was okay, and that stealing was okay. That would be fundamentally a God we would reject. I mean, in most cases, of course, everyone is prone to their taste, but there is a sense that this philosophical rational defense of right and wrong as having something to do not with our own subjective desires, but with something that is almost considered to be objective, which is certainly objective from Plato's point of view, but from our point of view, or my point of view in reading Plato and reading the Euthyphro, what I discover is a qualified defense of sympathy, of the possibility that what is ethical has something to do with the person in the moment of the ethical act. And yet that, once again, is a mere preliminary to my own kind of belief, because what I mean to do before I talk about what I think is to defend the serious possibility of there being ethical realist points of view, that there is such a thing as ethical realism. And it's almost outlandish to us, just that idea, unless you're a religious person or have some other kind of belief. But I think it's important, it's important for two reasons to understand ethical absolutism. The fundamental reason is that one wants to have a dialectic within oneself, so that even if you're believing in moral relativism, the only way you can be a human being and that you can even wrestle with your situation is by considering the possibility of there being an ethical truth. Because it's only in that possibility that alternatives arise and that choices are made. So first and foremost, one must consider the idea that there is something that transcends experience or is outside of experience as the basis for ethical claims, not because I say it's true and not because it is true, but because to think dialectically means to have a kind of conversation in which you're practicing what the poet John Keats called negative capability. So negative capability in many ways is the inherent ability to think according to the kind of opposites, to think in the kind of back and forth within oneself where a kind of truth is discovered in this kind of back and forth. In Plato and many other philosophers, it's taken to be a kind of dialogue, and of course it is a dialogue, but I think about dialogue with another actual person as being a trialectic. And the trialectic to me is when ideas become alive, when texts become alive, questions become alive. The trialectic is what happens when two people bring philosophy to life, bring thinking to life. But the dialectic for me is what I'm doing right here as something that I'm always doing as a part of my thinking. And the way that my thinking has operated since I was 19 years old has been what I call dialectic, but I had never called dialectic before. I mean, I just thought of it as having to do with the synoptic. I discovered the idea of the synoptic or the syntoptic. It's syntopic, syntopic. That's how I discovered it, which came from the Great Books tradition, which is a series of books, 52 volumes of the greatest books of the Western tradition, a collection of books published by the University of Chicago by Mortimer Adler and Hutchinson, And the first 2 volumes are what they call the Syntopicon. And the Syntopicon has to do with the investigation of fundamental ideas, but they're attempting also to deal with ideas against ideas. That is, to wrestle with the nature of books and questions within themselves is one thing. But the point of reading, and I think the point of thinking, is to bring questions in relation to one another. That is, to bring the text in conversation with one another. So one wants to read Shakespeare and Kant and Plato deeply, but one is ultimately reading them in lieu of a conversation with one another. And I think of that in many ways as being the dialectic within myself. And that's why for me, Kant, as representative of the possibility of a rational a priori ethical knowledge, is always working against Friedrich Nietzsche, who represents not a passive nihilism, but an active kind of nihilism, which is not only sensitive to the active nature of resentment as it tends to unfold within Kantian-oriented people. Nietzsche also represents a possibility, as he called it, of the reevaluation of all values. That would be the reconstitution of a sense of right and wrong in lieu of the reality and the truth that we're facing. And it's important to see Euthyphro and to see Plato, because I think he perfectly represents the real importance of rationality in thinking. Because when we're thinking about ethics, we're thinking about philosophical ethics. And that's not to say that like it's some kind of superior way of thinking, but all other ways of thinking which reject the rational are just doing bad ethics. Because once again, one discovers oneself in a kind of quasi-primitive situation where without the consideration trialectically or dialectically of alternatives, there is a kind of determinism that becomes real. And that's what's partially funny about people who believe in determinism, which happens to include myself on one level, which is that you end up becoming precisely what you believe. And so in regards to ethics, I think this not only has an ironic effect, but that it has an urgent existential effect. And so that's sort of one thing that I do want to say about ethics, which is often missed out. I'm dropping money. Which is that ethics is not a joke. And I'm not just trying to be coy or anything, but we forget that when we're talking about ethics, we're talking about human lives. And I'm not making at all the kind of claim that you find in college-educated idiots, which is the kind of belief that your own ideas have some relation to other people's lives, or that because you're aware of other people's trauma that you somehow have a privileged position, because that in itself is precisely not what the ethical would be. The ethical would be something that emerges within itself as a self-explanatory performative act that is almost blind to itself. I think that when one is considering the nature of ethics, one is considering something that, as I've said, is not a performative social act as it is in colleges, which is something that sort of gives you credit, or by posting up posters all around your college sort of gives you a kind of insurance against the possibility of violence. That in itself is unethical. And what you find, though, is that there are some people out there that in their bones take ethics seriously, and this can be a very dangerous thing if it's not really wedded to a kind of clear-sighted, meditative openness to, as I've said, the complexity of the world, and that includes the complexity of the self when facing it. But what I'm trying to get at in this kind of overly obfuscated, complicated monologue is that we have to free ourselves from ethical absolutism, which insists upon ethics for its own sake, or insists upon the belief in gods as the basis of our living. But we also have to free ourselves from the paralyzing effects of what seems to be a natural response to our world, which is to not believe in anything. We have to work against all of that by recovering the fact that in our own individual autonomous relation to the world around us, there is something like an ethical world that isn't merely abstraction. Because although I'm highly prone to abstraction, it never leaves me that my life is wedded to a web of relations that have an ethical consequence. Of course, this discovery and this kind of realization when I was 24 was explosive to me, because I already had this kind of intuitive insistence upon, as I've said in other videos, living out the ideas that I believe. And that in itself is strange in looking back, because I'm not even sure if I live like that anymore. But for the longest time, I didn't separate who I was from what I thought. And so that led me to a kind of dangerous life, a kind of open-ended, unplanned life that was driven by the consequences of my ideas. And these consequences are ethical. And in fact, it can be said that the simple distinctions, like the basic things that one learns in thinking clearly about ethics, actually do affect lives. They actually do have a life or death consequence. And I really think that a part of what philosophy does that surprises me is that in the minor, like almost casual discoveries or revelations that we make, it has a monumental effect on our life, on our experience. And changing the most basic ideas within us can change our lives dramatically. And so there's almost like an asymmetrical relationship between some of our more crucial ethical beliefs and how we live our lives, especially when you're young and you're discovering who you are and what you think. You don't really realize that you're setting in effect a series of events which go beyond who you are, as they do for each of us. And when I discovered the nature of complexity at a later point, in many ways, not as if that were a single discovery, but over time, that in itself began to paralyzed me further, but ultimately it opened me up, because as I learned to relax and to open myself up to the world, that seriousness that came with being so intense about ethics, about ethical thinking, especially as I began to realize that in believing that there's only a single world and realizing that we are animals, that these kind of claims are fundamentally contentious. And not only that, but then in my fundamental youthful, like rebellious nature, almost all of my beliefs were metaphysical and without grounding in experience. But that very ethical urge has never left me, except that it lives in a localized space. That is, the local is the ethical to me. And I think that when you discover that there are no narratives which survive the obliteration coming after the modern age, one is very much left in a position where one can be just like everyone else. And yet there are no everyone else, because what there is a kind of catastrophe, that there is a kind of wreckage, which people who are claiming the ethical ignore. That is, the people who are making prescriptive claims, who are constantly prescribing stories and explanations and narratives, are ignoring is the actuality of the fact that there are only bits and pieces and fragments of a previous world within which we're all living within. I'm not trying to be poetical for its own sake, and I'm not trying to tell a fantastical tale. But what I'm meaning to suggest is that there are billions of people on this planet who are wrestling with the birth pangs of a world that is perhaps aborting itself, meaning that we are in a transition, as we always were, towards an increasingly unreal world. And the beliefs, the most fundamental beliefs that grounded the Industrial Revolution, are slipping away for most people, and beneath that are the very beliefs that make us civilized people are slipping away. And one of the most fundamental beliefs of civilized people is the belief that things are, over time, getting better and not getting worse. I mean, it's an amazing thing that most people have. They just sort of believe in this momentum that's behind us that goes all the way back to the beginnings in agriculture. And it has to do with the beginnings of our belief in a future that begins with the planting of a seed. In planting a seed, you're sacrificing the pleasure that you could have from eating that seed, or all the seeds. So you're believing in a future by sacrificing the present. And our lives have improved in many ways worldwide, but they've improved especially after the European industrial revolutions. And this kind of momentum is the fantasy space within which our consumer worlds are swimming. I mean, if we, as consumers in a computerized database, are swimming, it is within this liquid motion of our ocean that is the belief that things are improving, and that so long as ethically we do the right thing, that the world would become better. When you look at the nature of the covenant is a kind of promise that we make with ourselves that even for secular people is a part of who we are. And of course the covenant is an expression of the Hebraic idea that rather than history and all of time being circular, and rather than it simply being linear in an infinite sense, that there was a beginning and an end, and that end had to do with the payoff of the consequences of our having made the ultimate sacrifices, that is, to have signed this contract and lived up to it. This in itself is precisely what is stripped away. This fundamental belief, you can't prove this. This isn't a scientific claim that you can validate, but it is in the nature of ethical claims. And when Nietzsche says that we have killed God, this in many ways is what he's suggesting. It's not really a claim about God, but it's a claim about people who believe in God, who increasingly do not believe in God, even when they say that they do. Not that there are people who truly believe and there are those who not, but that it's increasingly impossible to believe in such a thing. And so what we discover is either the reinvention of a God, or the individual pursues a new kind of understanding about their relation with the world. And so in ethical terms, that puts us in a position of having to make decisions. And in many ways, the very ghosts that we live with are the ghosts of these narratives that our lives now exclude. And I do think that to think ethically really means to think the impossible. It is not a possibility, as the ethical is not a part of reality. And yet the ethical confronts us as a kind of tear in our psyches, as something that is at the heart of our being. That is, we have to choose, we have to make choices about ourselves and about others. So I do believe that life is about right and wrong, in spite of the impossibility of such a thing. I do think that this excludes judgment, this excludes prescriptive thinking, this excludes thinking altogether. I think that right and wrong exist, but that no one knows what it is. No one has access to it. Nobody really has any clue or any way of explaining what right and wrong is. So I don't trust anybody. I don't trust myself. Anyone that says they know what is good and what is evil does not know what is good and what is evil. I think we have to let go of all of our beliefs, all of our thoughts about what is right and wrong. And I think when you do that, you begin doing what is right and not doing what is wrong. I'm not making a moral claim. I'm making an absence of claims. And what I'm trying to suggest is that one should notice that what is good in one's life, that is when one has a sense of piety, and piety is a quality that is almost non-existent, the way of honoring or showing gratitude to oneself, or towards one's own reality for what others have done for oneself. That in itself is almost a non-existent quality, but that in itself is in many ways at the heart of sensing that the good that has been done to oneself, which no matter who you are has happened at some point, has been done by people who are unconscious of it as such. That is, I think that there's an unconscious quality to ethical acts and to ethical thinking. And what has traditionally been called virtue is in many ways not an idea that exists in the minds of virtuous people, because it's almost as if virtuous people lived without minds. It's almost as if in simply being brains and in being bodies, we do what is ethical. But the ethical disappears so long as we announce it. And inversely, people who claim to be ethical, people who talk a lot about what is right and wrong, about what is good and evil, almost never, except probably accidentally, do anything that is good. In fact, I'm not the first one to say or to see that much of what is wrong in our world, much of what is bad in our world, happens because people truly believe they know what is right and wrong. They truly think that they know what is good and what is bad. And this seems very strange, but it's something that one discovers again and again through experience. You know, as a child who grew up in all kinds of different circumstances, I discovered often that strangers would step in and sort of do the right thing, more or less, in different ways, not always completely, you know, and it was often very mysterious. And more often than not, it was women. Sometimes it was women who didn't speak English. There was one woman, in fact, who took my brother and I in as a child without speaking English, who took care of us for more than a week, and who said nothing self-conscious about it, and said nothing after the fact, after things were back to normal. And so that, along with a number of other people, like for instance, my 4th grade teacher, you know, that the greatest teacher I ever had, it was sort of the greatest year of my childhood in school. She was good, did the right thing, and wasn't good in merely a way that was just giving to me. She was good in a disciplinary way. She was good because the love that she gave was tough. And so this isn't merely a sentimental, rosy kind of love that I'm talking about, but it is in the nature of ethical acts, which exist all over the world. So as a person who's sort of grown up, and I've kind of been around the block, I've discovered that the world is full of ethical people, like left and right. There are people all throughout the Midwest where I live, in rural areas, in suburbia, and in the inner cities, who will take you in, who will try to help if they have enough energy, if they don't have too much going on, you know. It's not saying that people are always ethical, but that people more or less will do what is right when they can. And its absence of abstraction, its absence of theory or self-justification is precisely what stays with me, because it in itself is emblematic of the nature of people who do what we call ethical, and when we think about it, can only be seen from an emotive point of view as being an expression of emotions, and from the point of view of critiquing altruism. I mean, even for myself as someone who rejects altruism, who rejects the possibility really that we ever think ethically about other people, I'm startled by the discovery that other people not only are only thinking about themselves in a reductive way, but that they're actually helping other people and helping themselves. In other words, there's sort of a dual effect in the ethical act, because it could be said that nobody is ethical, like ethics doesn't exist. That's what I keep going back to this. And perhaps it's the healthiest, strongest, clearest, truest point of view to have, which is that nobody is good or bad. Nobody is true or false, evil or good. And yet that doesn't preclude the possibility or the actuality that in your experience, reality won't announce itself as such. Because what I'm getting at is the fact that reality is telling us what to do, and that ethics has nothing to do with the rational consideration of what is right and wrong in the ethical act. That is, it is perhaps a step forward to consider the nature of rational ethics. That is, to think about ethics rationally, as I've suggested. And I think that's the power of philosophy in being able to help us make these kind of distinctions that can more or less save our lives. But on the other hand, the only way that we can become ethical is by not thinking, not having feelings, but by paying attention. And so when we're living with attention, and that is living through perception, that is just paying attention, reality tells us what to do. And what is right and wrong, as I just said, is almost never a question of thinking. It's almost always a question of courage. You know, I mean, when you think about ethics, about what is right and wrong, it's really about doing what is right and wrong. And that in itself doesn't have a theoretical justification or basis. And not only that, there's no one watching you. There's no one telling you. In most ethical acts, you're simply living with yourself. And so then the question is, why do what I feel to be right if it's working against me? You know, as a kid with certain proclivities, I had this feeling again and again, which is that if I didn't break the law, or if I didn't do what I had to do, that I was being duped, that I was being fooled, that I was being one of those kids or people who was just following the rules and then getting left behind. You know, I had this sense that it was about kill or be killed. And so I know that feeling, I know that instinct, and I also know what it's like to wrestle with a kind of conscience, not consciousness, but a conscience, which isn't ever telling you what to do. I mean, our conscience doesn't tell us what to do, but it lets us know when what we're doing is not right. It's one of the strangest things about being alive. And it's perhaps one of those things that's rarely talked about, which is that we never know what to do, but we often have a sense that what we're doing is wrong when it's wrong. And that, of course, would have to be a part of evolutionary psychology. That would have to have something to do with how we've evolved, but that in itself doesn't help us in considering the fact that we are wrestling with this kind of tension. And I think that that tension is precisely what has to be heightened, because that tension is precisely the ethical nature of being alive. But on the other hand, ethics doesn't help us, because not only does reality announce itself and we have to decide, but those decisions are already made. As I've said, it's a question of courage. It's a question of getting ourselves to do what we instinctively know is right. And so much of life is like that. And yet that in itself has to confront the fact that it doesn't offer any rational justification for what we do. There's absolutely no certainty, no promise. It's pure contingency. Everything is contingency, and it disappears into another kind of overwhelming complexity. And that in itself is paralyzing. And so here we are. And I have no qualms about it, because as in many videos, I end up suggesting that Ludwig Wittgenstein and Martin Heidegger are two philosophers who are worthwhile jumping off points. And in Wittgenstein's Logico Tractatus Philosophicus, he makes a distinction between the sayable and the unsayable. And the ethical is precisely the unsayable for Wittgenstein, along with the aesthetic. Of course, this is my own vision built on the constant sort of rereading of the Tractatus. But I think that what Wittgenstein was hinting at was the possibility that what matters most to us cannot be discussed at all. And this is perhaps obvious to anyone who senses the obviousness of it, that what is beautiful, and that what demands justice. It could be that justice can only exist as a localized thing within which we have a very limited grasp of. And it could be that justice publicly does not exist. Justice as an idea which can somehow wrestle us and save us from the density of our ethical political lives is non-existent. But I don't think the point is to resolve these questions. That's one thing within philosophy that is crucial, which is that there's an inherent openness to it. And that openness is the openness of a vision of the world, which answers itself. The world will answer itself. And I think that both sustains the complexity of it and offers the possibility of a solution precisely by sustaining it. But you all will have to let me know what you think. I've said a lot of things. I've tried to connect a lot of dots. But what I'm really hoping to do is to explain a little bit about the nature of ethical thinking in philosophy in the most basic sense. Except I'm also wanting to say a few things that have not yet been said by philosophy. I'm John Edward Willie, and I love you all.